Hello everybody, and welcome to a video on AP Historical Thinking Skills. And today we're going to be grappling with synthesis, one of the brand new skills, and this is a requirement on the LEQ, the long essay question, and also, at least for the time being, for the DBQ. And synthesis is difficult because it doesn't lend itself to some type of easy formula. There's no template where you can simply plug in some words and voila, you've done synthesis. So we need to start by really looking at the purpose of the skill in the essay. So what you're doing when you're practicing the skill of synthesis is you're strengthening your analysis. You're taking your argument and you're making it more persuasive. And you're doing that by showing that your argument is not unique to the situation that's been framed by the prompt. So, for example, if you're arguing in your essay that A caused B, or that this particular event was a turning point because of X, Y, and Z, you can extend or strengthen your argument by showing that A also caused B in another time period or geographic region, or that X, Y, and Z also marks an important turning point in some other era in world history. You can also bring another one of the 5 historical themes into your essay, or you can even extend your argument by bringing in another discipline to make your argument stronger and more persuasive. So here's a way to visualize this. In any LEQ or long essay question, you're going to have to describe causation, analyze continuities and changes, analyze similarities and differences or periodization. So when you're doing that, you can think of synthesis by, first of all, doing something called going vertical. That means that you're going to stay within the time period that you're talking about, and you're going to make your argument stronger by bringing in another theme or approach to history, or an academic discipline to bear upon your argument. Or you can make an analogy or connection to a different geographic area. And in that case, it has to be one that's not defined by the prompt. For example, if you're writing an essay about the causes of the fall of empires in Eurasia, to do synthesis, you have to move outside of Eurasia to show a parallel process that caused empires to fall elsewhere, for example, in Africa or in the Americas. Now, in addition to going vertical, you can move horizontally across the timeline to do synthesis. In this case, what you're going to do is make a connection to some different historical time period. So you're showing that empires fell in this era because of X, Y, and Z, but also, if you move ahead to, let's say, between 1450 and 1750, the same type of process occurred there. You see, that makes your argument stronger. Now, all this has been rather abstract. Let's look at some actual examples of synthesis to hopefully make this clearer for us all. So, we need a prompt, and here's a typical prompt on an LEQ. And this is using specific examples. Analyze the effects of trade on the development of cultures in Eurasia between 600 BCE and 600 Common Era. So before we get into what synthesis would look like in this essay, we need to understand what an answer to this essay would look like. So when you're dealing with how trade affected the development of culture in Eurasia, first of all, this is a causation question, and you might argue that it helped culture diffuse more widely. You might argue that religion followed trade on the Silk Roads, that cultures blended, or religions borrowed a great deal from each other. This is something that we call syncretism. So when Buddhism gets to China, its teachings on gender equality really relax somewhat, and they absorb some of the Confucian patriarchy. Also, when Christianity spreads across trade routes, it absorbs some of the shamanistic practices on the Silk Roads of Central Asia. And when Christianity makes its way into China, Jesus teaches the 8 cardinal virtues in Chinese Christianity, which are very similar to the Buddha's Eightfold Path. And his message wasn't called the gospel in China, but it was called the Tao. So we see a great deal of blending of cultures here because of trade. So there's one of the effects of trade on culture. Now, what would synthesis look like? You would have to take those processes and you would have to identify them in another region or another time period. So it might look like this. This is not the only time in history that trade had a profound effect on the development of cultures. When the Spanish brought the Americas into their trade network, Catholicism interacted with indigenous beliefs, Aztec and Christian rituals blended together to form new syncretic beliefs In the same way, belief systems blended on the Silk Roads. Notice that this is directly connected to the argument. It's not just a free-floating statement. To get the synthesis point, you need to make explicit connections back to your argument, and this one does it. Notice how it even kind of clinches it at the end. In the same way, belief systems blended on the Silk Roads. It makes it very explicit. So synthesis isn't simply just a shout out to something going on in another region or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, which some of you know what that means. No, it's strengthening your argument by identifying a process that occurred somewhere else, outside the parameters of the prompt. Now, there's another way to do synthesis. You can bring in another discipline to bear upon your argument, and I want to illustrate that right now. But this is one that most students don't attempt. It's a little bit more difficult, but nevertheless, here we go. Now, you may have taken an art history class, or maybe in your class you looked at the different ways that art expressed cultural ideas. And because of that, you could use art history as an outside discipline. Perhaps you looked at the changing images of the Buddha as Buddha spread into new areas. Or perhaps you looked at the way Jesus was represented in art all around the world. Or even how the same religion can create strikingly different architectural styles. So if you were to bring art history in as an outside discipline on this prompt, what might it look like? Well, it could look like this. The blending of cultures that came about because of trade can be seen in the field of art history. Now I want to stop there for a second. Notice that this links explicitly back to the prompt, back to the thesis. We were talking about a possible argument here that trade diffused cultures and allowed them to blend. And so that is seen right here at the beginning. And notice also that this explicitly calls out what discipline is being used. That's an important thing. You don't want the person grading your paper to miss that. It goes on. When Buddhism traveled the Silk Roads, the Buddha was often shown to express the styles and values of local cultures and art. Temples and churches also took on local styles and blended cultures. People are more likely to accept a religion when it seems more familiar to them, and art history shows us how religion adapted as trade brought it into new areas. Notice again, it kind of clinched it at the end, brought it back around, and showed that art history reinforces this idea that cultures blended as they spread across trade routes. So now let's look at another way you can do synthesis, and that is to bring in another one of the historical themes. This class is defined by 5 themes, and this approach works best when one or more themes have been explicitly mentioned in the prompt. So let's turn our attention to a different prompt here for a second. Compare the economic and political methods used by 2 of the following states to maintain their empires between 1450 and 1750. And here we have 3 to choose from. So in an essay like this, let's say if you chose the Russian and the Ottoman Empire, you might compare their bureaucratic systems, you might compare the role of the Tsar with that of the Sultan, their methods of tax collection, how they ran their economy, or anything like that to show the similarities and differences. And by the way, the word compare, when you see it in an essay, it always means similarities and differences. So we've seen theme 4 here, which is economic, and theme 3, which is political. So you could extend your analysis here. You could extend the comparisons, for example, by moving to another theme. So let's take theme 2, which is cultural. What might a synthesis statement look like when it pushes beyond the 2 themes of the prompt into a third theme? Their similarities in maintaining the empires go beyond economic and political methods. The Russians and the Ottoman empires also used culture to legitimize their states. Ottomans justify their expansion by claiming to be the bearers of the true version of Islam, just as the Russians thought they were marching as soldiers of Christ to defend the true version of Christianity, orthodoxy. In both cases, religion became important in expansion and maintaining obedience of the subjects. And notice here again, the statement at the end kind of brings it around, connecting it once again back to the prompt to strengthen or extend the analysis, which here are similarities and differences. So let's review synthesis really quickly here in conclusion. You can strengthen your analysis and synthesis by going vertical. That means by referring to another geographic region, extending your analysis by referring to another theme, or by bringing in another academic discipline to bear upon your argument. You can also go horizontal, and that means reaching back to a previous era outside the prompt or forward, and showing that what you're describing in terms of causation or periodization did take place in another time period or era. Synthesis is like saying, hey, my argument is strong because it happened before. It happened in another era. It happened in another geographic region. Or I can extend my argument by relating it to another theme. Or my argument is strong and persuasive because economics or anthropology or art history confirms my analysis. I hope that's been helpful for you. I know synthesis sounds rather difficult, but it does get easier as you go through the year because you've learned more instances or possibilities to bring in historical content. So that is it for this time, and I hope to see you next time with another video on historical thinking skills.